People were scared. They wondered, would there be another attack? Both Democrat and Republican administrations have been responsible for awful U.S. policies towards the Middle East.
إذا أردت أن توجهي كلمة الآن للمشاهد العربي.
I mean, I would just say that I'm so sorry.
تخيلوا أن تسعوا لسنوات إلى منصب سياسي رفيع رسمي ومرموق بعد دراسة وجهد وعمل دؤوب لفهم السياسات ونسج العلاقات فتصلون إلى الهدف المنشود، ولكن تماشياً مع قناعاتكم تتركوا المنصب وتستقيلوا احتجاجاً على سياسة حكومتكم.
أول انفتاح لأنيل شيلين على الشرق الأوسط كان في سن مبكرة حين حصلت أحداث 11 من سبتمبر، وعلى عكس الرأي العام آنذاك نشطت أنيل ضد الإسلاموفوبيا وضد الحرب على العراق في وقت لاحق، ليقودها ذلك إلى علاقة أكثر قرباً مع العالم العربي. زرنا أنيل في منزلها المليء بالرموز العربية.
أريد أن أبدأ من حدث غير السياسة الأمريكية وغير المجتمع الأمريكي، هجمات 11 من سبتمبر. كيف أثرت على حياتك وعلى خياراتك وقراراتك؟
When September 11th happened, I was in high school, and I remember immediately some of my classmates, before we knew what had happened, said, you know, it's the Arabs, we have to go after the Arabs or after the Muslims. And I just remember just feeling confused. Why did they immediately assume that that's who it was? It could have, we didn't know anything. It could have been like Oklahoma City, which was an American terrorist. But the sort of immediate Islamophobia, I remember just being fairly disturbed by. People were scared. They wondered, would there be another attack? Even though we were just in North Carolina, there wasn't any reason, there was no political reason to attack there. But it just spoke to this broader sense of paranoia that I think a lot of people had after 9/11, that, you know, this sort of thing could happen anywhere.
الآن بعد مرور كل هذه السنوات كيف تقيمين هذا الحدث؟
And I think it profoundly changed American society. We saw things like the Patriot Act having a significant impact. Obviously, then the subsequent wars. The U.S. spent, you know, trillions of dollars invading Afghanistan and Iraq, and, you know, the war on terror never really ended. The U.S. is still involved in military operations all over the world. And I remember my parents took myself and my brother to protest in Washington, D.C. There were counter-protesters. There were people protesting against us for protesting. And I remember just feeling just sort of shocked that, you know, Iraq didn't have anything to do with 9/11. Why are people here protesting us simply for this act of protesting a war? It was difficult. You know, at this time, I remember I was already fairly critical of U.S. policy, and I remember sometimes friends would say, you know, that sounds kind of un-American, or, you know, these things you're saying.
ولماذا اخترت أنت وأهلك بأن تنخرطون في مظاهرات مناهضة للحرب الأمريكية على العراق؟
You know, as a country, we're supposed to stand for something better than this. We're not supposed to behave in this way. We're not supposed to go and kill people. You know, the image that a lot of Americans have of this country is that, you know, to stand up for freedom and democracy. And personally, I don't really think that that's ever necessarily been true, but I would like that to be true.
وهذه المرحلة دكتورة شيلين كيف أثرت على خياراتك وعلى حياتك؟
It contributed to me wanting to study conflict resolution in college. I also studied abroad in Oman and lived with a family, and, يعني لبست حجاب وصمت رمضان وكانت كله it was a fantastic experience.
بعد عمان تنقلت أنيل في عدة دول عربية للدراسة والعمل، ما مكنها من تكوين تجربة واسعة ونظرة خاصة للمنطقة العربية وقضاياها.
مصر، اليمن، سوريا، الأردن، المغرب، وأيضا سلطنة عمان. لهذا نرى بعض المقتنيات هنا. هل تخبرينا أكثر عن هذا؟ تعرفين ماذا يسمى في الجنبية؟ أحسنتي.
من اليمن. اشتريتها في صنعاء. I know this one is for, I think, a married man, whereas the more curved one is for an unmarried man.
أنا لا أعرف هذه المعلومة. الآن أتعرف على هذه المعلومة منك.
Yeah, I first went to Yemen in 2007. I went there from Oman, and then I went back in 2010 and studied Arabic there because at the time Yemen was one of the best places to study Arabic because it was close to Fusha.
لدينا هذه الصور أيضا التي أيضا تبرز تواجدك في المنطقة العربية في الشرق الأوسط. ما هي هذه؟ أنت صورتي هذه الصور؟
Yes. So that was a little girl in Socotra. So when I was living in Yemen, I got to travel just to visit Socotra. I was curious. And so we went and I was with a guide and a friend, and we went and had lunch, I think, with this little girl's father, and she was sort of shyly, in the back. Her father was a fisherman, so we were just having some fish.
والصورة الأخرى؟
Oh, so this was actually taken earlier. That was taken in 2007 in Kaukaban in Yemen, and I, was just visiting, and again, I think of these places that have been so impacted by war. It's very sad.
لماذا اخترتِ القيام والتجول في المنطقة العربية بهذا الشكل؟
So I wanted to be in the Middle East to better understand the region after 9/11. There were not many Americans, at least that I was aware of, that could speak Arabic or that had spent a lot of time in the region. And so I wanted to learn. I studied Arabic. Now my Arabic is very rusty, but it used to be better.
تزامن وجود أنيل في المنطقة العربية مع موجة الربيع العربي عام 2011، مما ساهم بشكل مباشر في دخولها عالم السياسة.
هل وجودك في دول في الشرق الأوسط وشمال أفريقيا ساهم بطريقة أو بأخرى بقرارك دخول أكثر عالم السياسة؟
Yes, so certainly by the time the Arab Spring happened, I was back in Washington, or I had moved to Washington, and I was waiting to start a PhD program. And the people whose analysis I found most interesting to understand what was happening in the Arab Spring were political scientists. And so I wanted to be able to do what they were doing. They sort of seemed to have these insights and could explain what was happening. So that impacted why I ultimately decided that I wanted to do a PhD in العلوم السياسية.
بعد عودة أنيل من الشرق الأوسط عملت في وزارة الخارجية كمسؤولة عن تعزيز حقوق الإنسان منذ عام 2023، لتشهد بعد أشهر قليلة من ذلك أكبر تحد أخلاقي يواجهها مع اندلاع حرب غزة.
طبعا حدث هجوم 7 من أكتوبر، وأنت تعملين مع المكتب في وزارة الخارجية. بعده أطلقت إسرائيل حملة عسكرية وحرب دموية شاملة لم يسبق لها مثيل في قطاع غزة. كيف كان الانطباع الأول داخل المكتب الذي تعملين فيه في وزارة الخارجية؟
People were shocked by October 7th. It was a shocking attack, but fairly quickly I and my colleagues were aware of the way that the Israeli government was responding was a policy of collective punishment. They cut off the electricity, they cut off the water. You saw Israelis on social media mocking people inside Gaza for this, that they didn't have water. You heard the Israeli government describing these people as human animals, and almost immediately beginning this indiscriminate bombardment, just dropping bombs on civilians inside Gaza. So fairly quickly, I and other colleagues were very alarmed. We also knew from experience the way the Israeli government has responded in the past to attacks of these extreme levels of violence. And so I think, and also the extent to which the US continues to support Israel. I think and this is part of why we saw the resignation from Josh Paul just 2 weeks after October 7th, because he knew, he could see the weapons the US was sending and the ones that they were preparing to send. People just were increasingly aware of this was violating the US law. This was not actually making Israel safer. And just as time went on and it became clearer and clearer that this was going to be the way Israel responded, and that the Biden administration was just going to continue to support them.
كيف كانت النقاشات الداخلية خلال خاصة المرحلة الأولى من الحرب الإسرائيلية على قطاع غزة داخل أروقة وزارة الخارجية؟
There was an internal dissent cable in November that was leaked to the media. I signed that cable. I signed another dissent cable. I co-authored a dissent cable. So there's this internal process whereby employees can register their opposition to the policy. There was a support group for people who just felt so anguished by the fact that their government was doing this. Many of those people were of Arab heritage or they were Muslim, but many were not. They were simply, people who were shocked by what the US was doing. I attended a protest in November with other members of staff, people from congressional staff and executive branch staff. And I think over time, people just started to really feel more and more despair.
لم تكن مظاهرات غزة هي الاحتجاج الأول الذي شاركت فيه أنال، فقد نشطت لسنوات في عدة احتجاجات سياسية.
كطالبة في الجامعة، سواء في هذه الجامعة أو في جامعة نيويورك، هل انخرطتِ بنشاطات طلابية سياسية؟
So, as an undergrad at NYU, I remember when I first arrived, it was the Republican National Convention for George W. Bush's second term was held in New York City, which now seems sort of surprising. But at the time, it was after 9/11, and so there were big protests against it. So I had just arrived in New York, I was 18, newly out of my parents' home, and was protesting the fact that George Bush was coming and, the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan and everything. And that wasn't the only activism I was involved in. Also, later on, for the big Halloween parade every year that happens in New York, there was a peace activist group that would march in costume. So one year I think we dressed as like Abu Ghraib detainees to try to draw attention to this horror. One year we went as ghosts, for people who'd been killed.
بما أننا نتحدث عن الاحتجاجات الطلابية السياسية، كيف تقيمين ما حصل، خاصة تعاطي الإدارة الأمريكية مع المتظاهرين؟
I mean, it was really shocking. You saw this on so many campuses. So George Washington University was not the only campus where they called in police and they violently took down the encampments. There were really horrifying instances of that at Columbia University in New York and many other schools as well. And it's shocking. Also, you would hear people like Hillary Clinton condemning the students for protesting. And it's just so hypocritical because you also have people like Hillary Clinton supporting Iranian protesters, for example, because the US government is so opposed to the Iranian government. But when the American students do the same thing, protesting US support for Israel, it's unacceptable. In general, I think this is contributing to a real shift. I think generationally there's a whole generation of young people who will no longer wish that the US continue to support Israel in this way. And so in many ways, I think this overreaction and the violence with which these student protesters were met is just contributing to that. That, you know, someone who has seen the lengths that their own university or their government will go to silence them.
تعامل الإدارة الأمريكية القاسي مع المظاهرات الداعمة لغزة والدعم اللامحدود لإسرائيل في حربها على غزة وضع الدكتورة شيلين عند مفترق طرق بين موقعها السياسي ومبادئها الأخلاقية لتختار الرحيل عن الوزارة والاقتراب أكثر من الشارع.
متى شعرتي دكتورة بأنك لا تستطيعي أن تتابعي وتكملي عملك في هذا المكان؟
It's hard to say that there was an exact time. You know, for me, the timing of my resignation reflected the fact that I wanted to complete my year of service. Initially, I was not planning to go public. I was just going to communicate internally. You know, I let my supervisors know that I was resigning over Gaza. As I was starting to let colleagues know that I'd be resigning over Gaza, people said, please, you know, please do this publicly. And so about a week before I had said I was going to resign, I said, okay, I'll do it publicly.
Another U.S. official has publicly quit their government job.
Working on human rights issues in the Middle East resigned Wednesday.
Dr. Sheiline details the reasoning behind her public resignation.
She wrote, quote, "For the past year, I worked for the office devoted to promoting human rights in the Middle East."
What was going on? What was happening? What made you know, what was the process, I suppose?
You know, I didn't know what the reaction was going to be. I didn't think it would be as much as it was. And then there was, I think, a lot more of a reaction, probably because of the timing. I think by that point, public opinion had really started to shift and people were horrified by what was happening in a way that earlier on, there was, you know, it was not yet at that level, you know, that Americans were saying, what's going on? Why are we still supporting this? People are starving, you know, this is too many people that have died. So I was expecting a lot more hate, like online vitriol, or, you know, I expected to have to sort of deal with a lot of that. But honestly, people were very supportive, you know, people reaching out and just in general, I think by that point in the conflict, again, this was March, Americans and other people around the world were just so fed up with the fact that this was just continuing, and now here we are months and months later.
ردة الفعل عندما استقلتي، كيف كانت ردة الفعل المسؤولين في مكتبك؟
Right after I resigned, people reached out to me from state to say thank you. I think fairly quickly after that, the line from up above was, you know, she shouldn't have done this, this is inappropriate, you know, if you disagree with the policy, you follow the internal channels, you know, you don't go public. Because this is just not, you know, the State Department is all about, you know, things are secret, things are classified, you keep it internal, you follow the procedure, you don't talk to journalists, you don't say anything publicly.
بالحديث عن الإدارة المقبلة سواء بقيت ديمقراطية أو تحولت إلى جمهورية، كيف تقيمين السباق الانتخابي؟
Personally, I think both Democrat and Republican administrations have been responsible for awful U.S. policies towards the Middle East. We've seen decades of bad policies coming from, you know, politicians on both sides of the aisle. But in general, you know, I'm not holding my breath. As far as getting a better policy, I'm very concerned by what might happen if we did have a Trump presidency, not only on this issue, but on so many other issues. Fairly disappointing to see the ways that the Harris team was unwilling to sort of move on this issue or to show, you know, large numbers of Americans are extremely concerned about this, and she and her team haven't been willing to signal at all that they would maybe be better than Biden on this issue.
إذا أردت أن توجهي كلمة الآن للمشاهد العربي، ماذا تقولين له؟
I mean, I would just say that I'm so sorry. You know, I think that, you know, the United States has just been responsible for so much violence in the region and so much pain. I just think it's truly horrifying. And so it's part of why I wanted to study the Middle East, was to be, an example of an American who had spent time in the region, to show, not all Americans agree with these horrific policies, and, the hope that US policy will improve at some point in the future, inshallah.
شكراً دكتورة أنيل شيلين، المسؤولة السابقة في وزارة الخارجية المستقيلة احتجاجاً على سياسة الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية تجاه الحرب الإسرائيلية في قطاع غزة. شكراً لك.
شكراً لكم.
Thank you.